Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as cEDH. I'm one of your hosts, Lyndon, aka Noobzorps, and today I am joined by my co-hosts, Morgan, aka Spleenface.
How's it going, everyone?
And special guest, James, aka Squirrel Mob.
Hi, everybody.
So James, why don't you give yourself a brief introduction?
Yeah, hi, my name's James, better known as Squirrel Mob in most places. I've been playing Magic for close to 20 years now, playing cEDH for about 3, and when I'm not doing this cEDH project, I do puzzle testing for Possibility Storm, as well as running a couple local Facebook groups for EDH play.
Nice. Okay, so before we get into the main topic of the show, which is going to be on the Metagame Project, let's jump into housekeeping and new developments and get those out of the way so we can get into the meat and potatoes. So in housekeeping, we cover our new patrons, and this week we have a few. So, you know, couple members of the Gitrog server, I guess, is the kind of recent trend for patrons. So, you know, big shout out to Weaver, who is a new patron from the Gitrog server, to Tanner R, who I guess is pretty new to the Gitrog server, but is like a friend of one of our mods or something. And then, and as always, we've been doing for the past several weeks, not Jordan, because he has failed to live up to his end of the bet, and he will keep getting called out until he does. And then, I guess, Morgan, you can do the non.
We also have another new patron. So thank you to Lucas H for joining us.
Yeah, always good to see. I mean, I love seeing, you know, Frog server members come on as new patrons, but you know
something
what?
about eggs and baskets.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. As always, thanks guys for being new patrons, and thank you to our current patrons, existing patrons, and you guys rock. No cease and desist from the command zone, please.
You rock.
Okay. So new developments, a couple things here. Morgan, do you want to? Yeah, how would you do these?
Not really, no. But feels like we can't not talk about this. So there's a secret lair, and people have opinions. Yeah. Strong opinions.
Secret lair Walking Dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love playing commercials in their with Magic, you know? You know, what's good? Secret lair Mountain Dew,
for a
Secret Lair
show
Doritos.
Nice.
Yeah. No,
it's not ideal. As we're recording this, the RC have officially announced that they are not taking any action. They did say they would reconsider after community outcry. They'd consider banning them, but they've decided not to.
There is news. I guess actually this would probably have come out by the time we released this. But they came out definitively that they're not like blanket banning the new Secret Lair, like non-Magic product, I guess. But they're going to be looking further into specifically Negan. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
I don't watch The Walking Dead.
Yeah, me either.
I think it's Negan.
Okay.
Because he's awful.
Yeah, exactly. They're looking further into whether or not they're going to take action on that. So maybe this is news by the time this releases. Maybe not. Okay, so getting into the show, we've got a couple of intro questions laid out here. And these are all, it's basically kind of like interview style for James. So I've got the first few, and then Morgan's got the next ones. Okay, so hope you're ready. How did you get involved with cEDH and the cEDH online community? Yeah,
so about January of 2017, I stumbled across the competitive EDH subreddit and just started looking at some of the decks and thought, hey man, these are pretty cool. And it turned out that a couple people in my local game store were also already playing cEDH, so we kind of had our own small little local group that played intermittently. Sometimes there were only 2 or 3 of us, and we had a couple people who were like, well, we've got some high-powered decks, so we'll play with you, and would get smoked or whatever. And then around December of 2018, so I've been doing that for about a year, Timmy T1000 actually got a hold of me on Facebook and was like, hey, we're in the area. I'm looking to get cEDH going, do a monthly meetup for the state, and we dove into that. And so he kind of started it, and I've taken over since then. So we run outside of COVID times, we ran a monthly meetup for the state of Michigan to play cEDH. And the online part just kind of spiraled from there, commenting on Reddit and joining the Nexus eventually, actually using Discord for once in my life. And that kind of spiraled out more, and to the point where just recently I was one of the new moderators named for the subreddit based on my activities there.
Congratulations, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Also shout out to Timmy T1000. I know he listens to the podcast. The Michigan whole Michigan meetup structure, I think, is a great model for anyone interested in doing, organizing cEDH within their, I guess, state where things are pretty spread out. So it's a great model.
It's worked out really well because we did have the monthly meetups when we were able to do that, and we would rotate between 2 or 3 different kind of hubs, I guess you would call it. But in each of those places, there was already a little bit of an inkling of a cEDH group, and now all of them have a pretty solid cEDH group. And that's not even including probably the biggest cEDH group in the state, which is far enough kind of away from the rest of us that they do their own thing. And that's totally cool.
Awesome. So what decks do you play in cEDH?
So I play a lot of different things, which means I'm kind of bad at all of them because I don't have a whole lot of practice with any of them. But I've played probably the most. I enjoy the kind of Melt Banana build of Ydra's Storm, Gitrog. I enjoy having fun with that one. But probably the deck I play the most is Rashmi Control, which is not great, but I really enjoy playing it. So
fair enough. I mean, if you're willing to put up with the disappointments of Rashmi, then that's you're
about right.
Awesome. So what is the Metagame Project? How would you describe it? So
the Metagame Project started as a response to kind of community outcry after the printing of Thassa's Oracle, or rather the spoiling of Thassa's Oracle. The RC decided not to ban Flash at that point. A lot of people were very upset. And so I asked myself the question, how bad actually is Flash? Because at that point, it had been in my metagame, but wasn't oppressive or anything. That changed with Oracle a lot. And so I came up with a really quick Google form and said, hey, people, fill this thing out. Tell me, what the games you're playing look like. And so I've used that form, and it's changed a couple times, just to gather basic information from the games that people are playing. And then every once in a while, I take it, I gather it together, and make this write-up and create kind of a snapshot of what things might look like in cEDH right now.
Yeah, one thing that's kind of interesting about the Metagame Project is it's not, I guess, the first kind of, cEDH. The cEDH community has dabbled in tracking stats and performance of decks in the past with the Isperia bot on, I think that's run on several servers.
It's been run on cEDH Nexus, PlayDH, and the r/competitive EDH Discord server.
Yeah, so it's the thing with those where it's pretty. It was basically just who was in the pod and what deck were they playing, and whether they won. The great thing about the Metagame Project is because you have such a detailed questionnaire. I mean, it's not fully detailed. It's definitely
it's designed to be user friendly. It isn't always, but it's designed to be user friendly. So there's only so deep I'm willing to get before it becomes too weighty.
Yeah, no extensive essays required for submitting results. But because you're getting a bit more than just that, surface information from Isperia, you're able to get kind of a more interesting picture beyond just how certain decks are performing, and it's been really interesting to see those results.
Yeah. I think
Okay,
that.
so-
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, I think that some of the information that's not necessarily related to decks is actually some of the more useful information that is gathered by this, just based on everything else, because it's the thing that we can kind of control for the most.
And this segues perfectly into my next question, which is what data is collected and why is it important?
Yeah. So there are basically three major pieces to it. The first is obviously what decks are being played. So the way I do that is I've got a drop-down menu for players 1, 2, 3, and 4. Decks that are in the drop-down are either things that have been historically pretty popular for people to play, or things that are on the deck list database and people seem to be actively playing. Or they can choose other and just kind of fill in what the deck was. And that's tied to the seeding. So player 1 is the player who goes first, player 2 goes second, and so on. And the seeding helps us understand, what advantage or disadvantage is there to going at a certain point in the game in the turn order. And the last piece I gather is how long the games actually are lasting. So how many turns does it take for these decks to win?
Interesting. So we'll get more into specifics on how these things have changed over time or later on, but I'll pass the mic on to Morgan to get some more cursory questions.
Yeah, so what do you do for a living? Is it related to data analysis?
Only sort of, but not really. I am a American history teacher for middle school students. So the data that I analyze in my job is very simply like test data and how students are doing on certain things, and not anywhere near as complex as this. And that's not to say that this is all that complex at all anyways. But I just kind of enjoy doing it. I enjoy being, I guess, a glue guy, for lack of a better term. Like there was a thing that looked like it needed to be done, and I felt that I could do it, and so I did it. And that's kind of how this mostly got started. It's just a way for me to both be helpful and kind of relax while crunching numbers and writing a lot. And that kind of helps me unwind from things that are completely unrelated to that.
Makes sense. So how has this project shaped your perception or understanding of the cEDH meta and how it's evolved and changed over time?
Yeah, so my first inkling of what a meta would look like for cEDH happened back when Paradox Engine got banned, actually, which was kind of what planted the seed for doing this even before Oracle got printed. Because Sheldon asked on, I think, the MTG Nexus forums or something, what does the metagame look like? And a bunch of people answered. And it was stuff that I kind of recognized, but didn't recognize it in my own meta all that much. And somebody had said, hey, I've got data, which I think was actually from Asperia at the time. And I was like, all right, that's interesting. And so since I started gathering the data myself and doing it this way, I've gone from thinking that there is sort of a definitive cEDH metagame to sort of thinking that there is, but it's more a patchwork, almost like a mosaic of smaller localized metagames that sometimes overlap and sometimes really don't. And what you do in your own local meta is far more important than how it matches up to, what we see as the whole picture. I don't even think we have the whole picture necessarily.
Yeah, I know personally the way I kind of envision it is that, a lot of it is obviously local metas interacting and people deciding that they want to play a deck because it appeals to them or something. And I think the kind of idea of an overarching cEDH meta is somewhat true, but it's kind of largely informed by the overall community and how the message gets passed along, Thrasios and Tymna is tier 1 and this is the best thing to be doing through content creators, podcasts or YouTube videos, gameplay, or online discussions on the subreddit or discords. That's, I think, kind of informs a bit of the meta choices for people in disparate groups, but it's definitely not
Yeah, I really agree with that. Thinking about
I I heard that the cEDH meta is just dominated by Scion Hermit Druid decks with no interaction going as fast as possible.
Wow, do we have a time traveler from...
But, I mean, Scion Hermit Druid was probably the best deck from, like, was it 2010 when Necrotic Ooze was printed to 2012, and then in 2013 we got all the options from Commander 2013. But, like, I'm pretty sure I heard people talking about Scion Hermit Druid probably at least until, like, 2015.
Yeah.
Even when it, like, wasn't a deck anymore.
I mean, I recall at a GP Detroit, it was Eldrazi Winter, actually. Somebody was playing a Scion deck at one of the tables of EDH I was playing at, and another player was like, "Oh, I know what you're on. You're doing Reanimator. You're a cEDH deck. You're gonna go fast." And the dude's just like, "No, this is dragons," and he was not lying. It was dragons.
Yeah, that's funny. Some commanders are completely deceptive.
Yeah,
so like, oh my god, Virals, you must be doing Virals Hulk, and then someone just entombs a Death Shadow
just,
or
like,
something.
Scavenge.
Yeah, there's a few
Virals
things like
Voltron
that.
deck.
There's like a handful where it's like, oh, that doesn't really seem like it should be anything, and it's just like, oh no, you're like the Thing. Like, way to Wilfred Brimley me there.
Okay, so let's get into, I guess the more details of the Metagame Project. So first point we have here is just what are some key takeaways from the results that you've noticed? Metagame diversity, what does an average game look like?
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
So I'll start with the average game because that's a little bit easier to discuss. For the most part, there's been kind of two things that have held pretty constant. The first is that the player going first, which this probably will not sound like news to anybody, but the player going first has won an outsized share of games. By what range more games than we would expect they win has changed from week to week or month to month. But it's well above, like, in a perfect world, it'd be 25% across all 4 seats, and it's not that. I don't think it's dropped below a 30% win rate for the first player in any of these check-in points. So that's one thing that we see, is that the player going first really seems to have some sort of advantage. The other thing is with turn game length, we see that for the most part, since the inception of this, way back when Flash and Oracle were still together, the modal turn on which games have ended has been either turn 6 or turn 7. Right now, I've got them combined. In the future, I'm going to separate them to get a little more granular with it. But we see that seems to be when games are really hitting the threshold of when things are going to end more or less by this point, like 70% of the time. One thing I've noticed in the last month or two has been a little bit of an uptick in speed, though. More games ending on turn 3, turn 4, and turn 5. And I think that's... My speculation is that that's a response to Underworld Breach becoming more popular, and with it, Dockside into like Ad Nauseam and things like that. So some more fast decks kind of approaching the meta than before. That being said, with diversity, it's all over the place. I mean, there's a few decks that have consistently been very popular. Kess, Gitrog, First Sliver, Najeela. Unsurprisingly, things that like we would think of as, you go into a room, you ask for a cEDH game, you might expect for any of these to be at the table. Tymna and Thrasios, that's another one that's pretty consistently been up there. And those decks eat up a lot of the different games that are submitted. But there's lots of other stuff. Inala is pretty popular. Kinnan has risen a lot since it got printed. We see different forms of Thrasios Tymna, so there's different kind of styles of it that people are playing. Kenrith decks, Golos decks, all sorts of stuff. In the last update, I believe we had a total of 213 different decks that were submitted as of... Jesus. This would have been as of April, or since April. And of those, nearly half of them won at least one game, which is pretty, I would say, fairly healthy in terms of decks are at least showing up and competing. Maybe they're not the best, but they can hold their own.
Well, I think also the other good indicator is that we have 741 games recorded, and Kess is the most played deck at 174 games, which means that it's 6% of the meta.
Yeah.
Like, and that's the most popular deck being submitted here.
Looks a lot healthier than standard right now. Rip, I saw a top 32 result where I think there was only one non-Omnath deck. So
I mean, they're both four color
formats. Doing pretty good.
But yeah, I think the diversity has been pretty good. Like in the first iteration of the project, I ran a little bit more detailed analysis on anything that was more than that showed up in more than 5% of pods. And in April, I decided I got to up that to 10% because there were like 25 or 26 different decks that hit 5, and I'm like, that's too much work for me. I gotta chill. I gotta chill on that a little bit. So, but we still see that. Like, we see a lot of decks kind of hit that 5% range. And stuff that you might not expect, like Brawlin and Shabraz has remained fairly popular. Kazur and Ukima, that seems to be a deck that people have really enjoyed playing. Yisan has been above that 10% range pretty much the entire time, for better or for worse. So it's pretty nice to see like a lot of different things that people are trying out.
Nice.
All right.
Yeah.
So we sort of went over the generals. What were some of the most interesting or unexpected results that you saw? Like, did you see any standout decks in terms of occurrence or performance or odd matchups?
Yeah, there's a few here and there that are pretty interesting. The kind of differences between some of the decks that use the same generals kind of stand out as interesting to me. So like Blue Farm is a little bit over 25% win rate, and Opus Thief is a little bit under, but they're pretty close to each other, which I thought was pretty interesting because they're fairly disparate play styles from what I can tell, and maybe I'm wrong about that. Another one that really has been mildly interesting to me that's kind of risen in popularity and has been pretty consistently in that 25 to 28% range is Selvala Brostorm, which is a deck that in my own local meta, we kind of joke about it being like, Mulligan, do you win or you die? So it's interesting to see that the people are having a pretty decent amount of success with it in certain other metas. Urza not being as strong as we might expect stands out as a little odd. It only, as of the most recent update, only had about a 17% win rate, which, being arguably the best mono blue deck in the format, with blue being arguably the best color, you might think that it would stand out a little more, and it really doesn't seem to be doing that.
Has that been a trend since you started tracking, or is this kind of just been recent? Because I know commander reliant decks can definitely suffer under Draenith.
Yeah, it's been more recent, but with all of these, the trends are usually not sustained for more than one or two updates. So let me give you an example of that. In the most recent update, Elsha shot up quite a bit in the amount that it was played in popularity, and its win rate went up a little bit too. And so for a long time it was kind of down there around that 10%, showing up in about 10% of pods that were submitted. And now it's kind of shot up a bit above that to about 13 or 14%, and has like a 25% win rate, and it was like 21 last month. So somebody played a bunch of games with Elsha, and that's fine. That's totally great. But it kind of underscores the point that even necessarily week to week, we can see, or month to month, we can see pretty big shifts in both the popularity of a deck as well as the win rate, which is kind of why those decks that kind of consistently are both doing well and very popular, the Gitrog, Najila, Kess, First Sliver, they kind of stand out as sort of the exceptions to the rule. They're both very popular, and almost all of them are within the realm of what we would expect a win rate to be.
So one of the interesting decks that doesn't actually appear as much in this in these results is Zur, which has historically been a very strong deck. Do you have any thoughts on why it might be that we're not seeing?
Yeah. A non-zero factor in Zur could be that kind of magistrate effect, where it's a commander reliant deck that's not necessarily always the fastest. Another issue might boil down to my own way of dealing with classification, because Zur has gone through a few different iterations of what it looks like. In the drop-down menu for the easy-to-select decks, I still have Shimmer Zur as the deck that people can select. But Consultation Zur has actually been submitted more than Shimmer Zur, despite being a deck that people would have to type in. And then there's a couple other variants of Zur, which, realistically, they might all be pretty close to the same deck. And so while people are submitting them as slightly different things, I'm classifying them as slightly different things, and that might be not as accurate as it needs to be, which is one of the potential pitfalls of doing it this way.
Okay.
I think also one of the other sort of personal takes I have on Zur is that it's not like super well. It's still a fine deck. It's not super well positioned now, but it's also like you get no points for playing it. You know, like no one's like, oh man, I'm going to build Zur and it's going to be like a cool deck. It's going to be different. It's going to be unique. It's going to be fun. Like none of those things.
Yeah, and I feel
so then it's like, oh, you built that really strong commander who's been around forever, huh?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
I feel like there's a reasonable number of people on Zur who have been on Zur for a long time, and it's not necessarily attracting all that many new players either.
Probably.
Like, I built a Zur deck during Flash Hulk Winter, just to see if I could build something that could fight it. Spoiler alert, it couldn't. But, I don't know that there's that many people experimenting with it right now either, because it's kind of a list that's been built and refined and tuned for so long that it would take something really off the wall to kind of shake up sort of established practice with it, is kind of my feeling.
Yeah, someone who's played Zur a decent amount, the things have definitely homogenized since Thassa's Oracle. Whereas before, when you were doing Shimmer stuff, there was like, oh, how are you going to do? Are you going to lean more into Shimmer? People doing Doomsday, more stacks. Whereas, these days it's just pretty obvious that Consult is the thing to be doing. So, things kind of consolidate around that. One question I had in terms of like unexpected results. So you mentioned earlier that game length going to 6 or 7 turns being kind of like where most games are ending. This kind of goes against what I would say like the pervasive narrative for cEDH has been. Do you want to, I guess, comment on that? And then one also thing I want to kind of tack onto that is there any decks that you've noticed have a particular proclivity to like increase in their win rate as the game goes on, or is it kind of like similar between all decks?
Yeah, so in terms of like, we have this idea that cEDH is a turn 3 format, right? That's what we hear a lot of the time. And even though the modal turn that games are ending is like 6 or 7, I don't necessarily think that disproves that notion, actually. Because if we take all the win rate, or the rate at which games end on the different turns, more than half of them are ending on turn 6 or 7 or earlier, like 70% or so, and around that time or faster. So what we see with that is that turn 3 area, maybe it's not important that you necessarily win that turn, but it's important that you be able to impact the board or the stack or threaten to win or do something. You have to be able to be in the game by that point, which I do think, even though it's a little bit of a truism, I think it's honestly fairly accurate that, if you're not already doing something more than just land go by turn 2 or turn 3, then you're probably not really you've either got a really crappy hand or you're not really up to snuff with what everybody else at the pot is doing. In terms of decks that do better the longer they go, there are some discrepancies between different decks that do better faster or do better later in the game. One that kind of stands out is, like, for example, Elsha seems to do pretty well, sort of both early and late, which is kind of interesting. So it's like got a pretty good win rate at the beginning and a pretty good win rate as the game goes longer, but dips a little bit in the middle. We also see First Sliver is really interesting. So the longer its games go, the worse it kind of seems to do. But it does really well earlier on in the game.
It makes sense. No value engine in the command zone.
Right.
But obviously great win con. Yeah.
Yeah. And the one that kind of stands out as the weirdest, although not maybe honestly not that weird, is Tymna and Thrasios. Right? So we would think that you put Thrasios in the command zone, you spice them up with maybe a little bit of, Seedborn Muse or Training Grounds or whatever your particular flavor of TNT is. We see that it does really poorly early on. Like, it was in like 65 games that ended before like turn 5 and only won 6 of those games. So like that's about 9%. Not great. And then in games that went really longer, like past turn 7, it only won about 18%. But in that mid-range spot, which is, again, unsurprising, it really won quite a few games and did quite better in that range, which is interesting because you would think that with a deck like that, the longer the game would go, it would go from, maybe not great in the early game to pretty good in the mid game to really excellent late game, but it doesn't really match up with that all that well.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I wonder if that's because, like, one of the things that's sort of hard to factor out here, and we'll get into, we have a section on biases later, but just if things aren't going wrong for Thrasios and Tymna, it's reasonably likely that they'll kill you on like turn 6, 7, or 8. Like they'll have accrued a substantial amount of card advantage through their commanders, and then it's like, okay, now I can kill you. So the fact that the game is going past that length might be an indicator that something bad happened to them. They stumbled on lands and they couldn't get their Thrasios online, or, maybe they tried to go for a win and then they got stopped and were just left with like nothing. So that's like, there's a it's not exactly a survivorship bias, but like a similar idea where if a deck is trying to kill you on turn 7 and it fails to do that, then, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be doing super well.
Yeah. And there's a few other decks that kind of fit that same sort of idea too, like Korvold. And Korvold's a weird one because, like, when this project started, Korvold was still very much a food chain deck, whereas now I don't know whether there's consensus whether it should be not a food chain deck or not, but there's been discussion around that question of, like, which way to take it. Should it be food chain? Should it be dockside? Should it be both? Should it be... I don't think neither is an answer there, but, should it be something else?
It should definitely be dockside.
Yeah, right. Like, it should definitely be dockside. Neither is not an answer.
Maybe it should also be food chain, but it should definitely be dockside.
Yeah. But, like, Korvold is a deck that, for whatever reason, has almost 75% of its wins coming before turn 5. So, like, it's been in games that have gone longer than turn 5, but it hasn't won very many of them. Now, that could be part of the difference in the way that it's been built. It could be some weaknesses the deck has overall. It could be just the decks it's up against happen to be better. Who knows? But it's interesting to see kind of some of those places where there are disparities. The weirder thing is, though, that more decks don't have much of a disparity. There's some dips here and there, and in some cases that might be explained away by even just sample size, because we're not talking about huge numbers here or anything. But like Najeela seems to be pretty consistent across the board. Kess seems to be fairly consistent across the board. Even First Sliver, like aside from dropping off a bit at the end, like still isn't horrific in late games. Like, so we have, some of the most popular decks also seem to be ones that sort of either have longevity in a game or have the ability to win off of just a couple pieces assembled. So, if you get to later in the game and you're top decking, you only need one or two things that can maybe make it easier. And I think Najeela is a really good example of that. I mean, you put Najeela down and she can win a game by herself if everybody's in top deck mode.
So you mentioned that you noticed a trend in the meta speeding up. Is that just relative to, post Flash ban, or is this kind of a trend you've noticed since the very beginning?
This has been post Flash ban. In fact, it's really been the last couple updates. So like Flash was the first couple updates after Flash was banned really matched the updates before Flash was banned pretty closely. Games ending about half before turn 6 and about half from turn 6 onwards. Whereas now it's a little more than half before turn 6 and a little less than half turn 6 onwards, which isn't a huge difference, but we're talking 3 or 4% over about 1,000 games in both instances. So it could be statistical noise, but
well, it is dragging the existing sample with it, right?
Yeah, it is, right, and that's the thing. It is bringing. So we had more like wins on turn 4 this last update than we had previously, and so I've seen a few different takes on why that might be the case. Not talking specifically about this, but people talking about, for example, the finish meta, which is very ad-nos centric and, by my understanding, very quick, very fast-paced, and some people following, kind of emulating some of those decks. A lot of pressure to go fast is turning into really powerful dock sides, which are, powering out really powerful plays much earlier than we might expect. Things like that, which there are answers to, and maybe they're not as good as they need to be. I don't know. That'd be speculation, but it's interesting to see kind of that interplay of people's perceptions and then how things kind of mirror those perceptions later on.
And one more thing before we move on to the next section, and that's I'm going to get you to talk about Tashar, because this is a particular deck that has stood out to me in these reports, where not only is it much more popular than I would have expected, coming in and the most recent report at number 7 in terms of popularity, like very, very high for a mono white deck, especially given the reputation mono white has in cEDH, but then also coming up with a decent win rate as well.
Yeah.
So you want to speak to that on
Sure. Yeah. You're going to get me in trouble with the Teshar players. So Teshar...
yeah, we should also say the win rate that it had recently, I think, was 44%.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, 44 out of 100 games. Made the math really easy on that one. So Teshar is a deck that has been really, from my understanding, has been really heavily tested and built up over time by a handful of individuals who really want the deck to do well. And that's great. I mean, that's what brings brewers to this community, and they do great things, and we get new decks from it. And they all are very diligent about posting their games. But what that's resulted in is a situation where the metas where Teshar is getting played a little more often are overrepresented in the numbers overall. So one way that we can kind of see this is this weird little chart I do where I match up the key decks against each other. These decks that have over the 10% pod rate showing up. And we can see there that Teshar has fewer games overall against some of those other most popular decks than many of the other most popular decks have against one another. And that kind of is an indicator that Teshar's being played in some specific metas where it seems to be doing quite well, but maybe that those individual metas don't mirror what people are seeing in their own games. And from my own personal experience, like I've played Teshar basically since it came out in Dominaria. My build is a little bit different than the guys who are really, really putting a lot of time into it, and admittedly, it's probably worse. But I didn't have anywhere near that level of win rate with it. I think the deck is legitimate. I do think it can hang at a cEDH table. I think there are some pieces of stacks it folds to that maybe aren't being played as much in certain places that could account for some of this. Like, I don't know how much Null Rod or Collector Oof they're seeing, just because, like, in my experience, if I don't have a Path or a Swords, I'm pretty dead to Oof, which is not great. So I think it's largely a remnant of kind of those two factors of both being played by people who are really competent with the deck and are really trying to make sure they've got the best build possible, and being submitted really regularly so that those games that it shows up. I mean, do I think that we have every Teshar game that's been played since April? No. But I think we have a higher rate of Teshar games out of all the games with Teshar being played than we do compared to any other deck. And I think that affects the numbers somewhat.
Interesting. Okay, so moving on to the next category. What data do you wish you had that you don't collect? Or, maybe it's because you don't collect it because it would make it too cumbersome to put on the form. Or is there anything you plan on adding to the form? Or like if you could ask a genie what statistics
if I could be like omnipresent and see every single game of cEDH being played everywhere, there's a couple other things I would take into account. Mulligans, I think, would be really fascinating to have information on. I think that they probably affect things quite a bit, but without adding them into the form would be, I think, too cumbersome. Because people submitting these forms already have enough to keep track of, and adding on to that, how many times did each specific player mulligan is a whole other level of detail that is going to turn people off from doing it in the first place. I think that's probably the single biggest piece of information that's missing from this. Because I think there's a lot that could be explained by mulligans.
I feel like certainly that's the kind of information where, like, you'd have to go back, at the end of a night of playing games, you could kind of remember, it's like, okay, who went first? Like, the decks I was playing against is not hard. The turn order is, like, a little bit hard, but pretty doable. But then, like, you'd go, oh, shoot, I have to ask everyone how many times they mulliganed. Never mind. Like,
Yeah, exactly. And, like, similar to that, but again, it would be much more detailed, and, like, if we could see how many times people had a turn one mana positive rock, so, Crypt or a Vault or a Soul Ring or a Mox Diamond or whatever, that would probably be really useful information. But again, would be way too much to gather. So I know that, like, the Command Zone podcast or videocast or whatever you want to call it has done some statistics episodes where they have those kind of statistics, but they go in and actually look at, like, gameplay video, which is an entirely different beast altogether. So they kind of have that information, but selected from a different sample of people.
Yeah. Is there anything you plan on adding to the form?
Yeah,
or gonna keep it as is, you think?
So my plan right now is to change this. I was going to change it at the end of October, but we just got news today that unsurprisingly and disappointingly, Commander Legends has been delayed a little bit. So I'm probably going to do 2 more months with this form as is. And I've got some good ideas from people on things to consider adding. So things like even having a way for people to say, I don't remember the exact turn order, or I don't remember the exact turn it ended on, might get more people to submit games. Possibly having some more detailed information, like not too much, but a little bit to help focus decks when they're submitted as other. That could be something both useful to me and useful to the readers. And like I said, I think I mentioned this earlier, I'm going to get more granular with the turns. Like, that's a thing I know I'm going to do, is I'm going to separate turn 6 and turn 7 and turn 8 and turn 9, just to be able to get a little bit more detailed and dig down a little deeper into those specific pieces. But I'm also open to suggestions if people have them.
So one thing I think, I mean, I'm not really necessarily saying this as a suggestion, but kind of like a, I don't know, just throwing ideas out there. So one thing that would kind of interest me is to see how player skill affects these things, and, you know, the popularity of decks. Obviously, you know, if a bunch of new players who maybe aren't experienced can maybe affect the win rate, or maybe, you know, some decks just perform much better if you've got, you know, a really skilled pilot, and, you know, new players do very poorly, or some decks are just, you know, pretty even across the board. I think that'd be interesting, and, you know, you can that's something that you could maybe see if you look at Isperia stats. That's something I've delved into the past, where you look at breakdowns of individual players, how they perform with the decks. So I take it no plans for player tracking or anything like that?
There isn't currently, for two reasons. The first is because these games are self-submitted by people, they could know potentially how long they've been playing a deck, you know, what build they're on, things like that, and could give detailed information about themselves. But especially with how many games are played over webcam or Trice, there's not a great way to know that about your opponents, unless you take like 5 minutes to talk about it at the end of the game, and nobody really wants to do that, I don't think. So that's the biggest hurdle, in my opinion. The other issue is just respecting people's privacy. Like, I don't necessarily want to keep detailed statistics on individual people. Even when people submit games now, there's an opportunity for them to submit like their Reddit username or their Discord tag or like an email address or something, just in case I have questions or want to follow up with them on something. But it's entirely optional, because just being concerned about not wanting people to think I'm up to anything nefarious, I choose to err on the side of not kind of collecting that kind of information, for better or for worse.
And any ideas that either you have or you've heard about, I guess, increasing the size of the data set by either, you know, getting more people to submit forms, from lessening the barrier to entry, I guess, you know, like an app or something, or integrating this with like a life tracker app, or anything like that? That
would be a thing that I think would be hugely beneficial and make everybody's life easier if it could just like have an app where you enter stuff and it automatically tracks it and you don't have to worry about anything else. That would be great. Unfortunately, I do not have tech skills to do that, and I also don't have a lot of extra money to pay somebody to do it for me. So while I would love that to be a thing, and there was an app that somebody was advertising on the subreddit like in like May or April or something, where they said like you can input a metagame, and I'm like, hey, can you input just a general standardized cEDH metagame? And they're like, no, you have to have local ones. I'm like, okay, well, that's nice, but it doesn't actually do what I want it to do. So all right.
Okay, listeners, you heard it here first. If any of you have the skills required to help Squirrel Mob with his project, and, you know, you're willing to devote some, I guess not just devote, some volunteer some time, you know, just reach out.
Yeah. And I'm kind of disappointed in myself a little bit, because like my dad's a computer programmer, but like I have none of those skills whatsoever. So it's like I can write, I can analyze different things, but man, you put me in front of a computer, I'm like, all right, if it's not Word, I don't know that I can do this.
So Morgan, why don't you go ahead with the next section?
So what, if any, biases do you think are present in the data, and how should that color our interpretations of the data? And have you thought about ways we could try and correct for them? So things like reporting biases.
Yeah.
You mentioned your biases with regards to which decks you gave people the choice of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's like 2 or 3 big ones. I think probably the biggest single one is reporting biases, like you mentioned. Because this is self-submitted data from people playing games, there's no real like control group here. There's no real way to say, somebody's necessarily submitting in good faith or bad faith. I just kind of have to cross my fingers and hope that nobody's trying to milk the numbers. I don't have reason to suspect that anyone is, mind you, but some of the numbers lead people to make those accusations anyways, which isn't great. So that's just sort of the price of doing business in this way, I guess, because I don't know that there's a more convenient or widespread way to gather data. Obviously, there's the bots, but they get slightly different things, and they only cover people playing on those Discords. And like if we had it attached to an app, anybody using the app could use it, but it might not get people who don't do that, who are using Spell Table, which keeps track of your life for you instead. So the Google form, the benefit is it's a universal platform, I guess, but with that comes the danger of it's only as good as the numbers and data and information that people are submitting. And hopefully any of those kind of baked in individual biases are coming out in the wash, but I don't know that that's the case either.
So one of the interesting things that I remember we talked about this a while ago, and you added the which player is submitting this pod option to the form. So I went through, and since you added that, which was
a couple updates ago,
a couple updates ago, looks like it was around 60% of the data is from before that, but in the 40% after, the person who submitted and the person who won were the same person in 46% of games.
Right, and that's definitely a thing where we might be seeing people submitting their best games. There's also a few groups I know where people have a specific person who submits, which might not necessarily be tracked across the person reporting, because they might be seat 1 one game and seat 3 the next game. But some of that shows up in the people who choose to respond with a username. So there's a lot of usernames I see that are submitted, 6, 7, 8 different times, like in chunks of 2 or 3 at a time, where it's like, okay, this is a person who submits for whatever games they're playing. And those can both lead to those sorts of biases as well. Both in terms of like, am I submitting my best games only? Because that's not great. It's not perfect. Or it could lead to the issue where we have that oversaturation of certain metagames. If there's a couple people who really do this every time they play, and they play with the same people repeatedly, then those people get overrepresented relative to the size of the player base at large.
Yeah, and certainly it doesn't even have to be like deliberately, we don't have to accuse anyone of acting in bad faith or trying to only, put in games that they win. But I mean, I'd imagine that in some metas, an easy way, it's like, oh, let's all submit our games, and then just like, oh, the winner will submit the game.
Right.
And then probably some people are more and some people are less diligent about that. But also just, I'd imagine that if in a given metagame, one person is the person submitting the decks, they're probably just more dedicated to cEDH in general, which would like be there'd be like correlated factors for
more experience, better knowledge of what their opponents might be on,
and just investing more time.
Exactly.
So that could certainly introduce some of that.
Yeah, I mean, pilot skill is definitely a thing that is at least with this data and the way it's being collected, not necessarily something that's easy to control for. And I think probably the deck that is the most... Well, I think there are 2 decks, actually, that have been submitted a bunch that are the most representative of that. One of them is Inala, where on one of the more recent updates, some of the Inala players, kind of mentioned that it's mostly the main people developing and working on the deck who are submitting games, because they're using it for testing information as well, which is great. I mean, that's what it's here for. Awesome. But do I think your average person, your average cEDH player off the street could pick up Inala and be that successful with it? Probably not, because it's not that intuitive a deck compared to some other ones. And the other is like Golos Storm, which has still an absurd win rate. But I happen to know that that absurd win rate comes from a couple people who were really jamming the deck hard and doing very well with it, and then have moved on to something else, which is why its win rate has been dropping over the last couple of updates. Is the people playing it since then do not have that same level of pilot skill.
Yeah, and I think one of the, people can go back and forth on is the data biased when we see results we don't expect? Is it that the data is biased, or that our expectations are biased? Particularly, I've seen some people talking about Tishar and saying no, this deck is actually, this deck is actually a very strong choice, and I might disagree. I've dabbled with the deck a little bit. I think that looking at it, it seems like it doesn't, it's easy to interact with on a lot of axes, and the mono white card pool is limited. The mono anything card pool is limited,
yeah,
but white in particular, red as well. But I remain confident that no one's bias is strong enough that if any of these decks with a 40% win rate were that was actually indicative of the deck's performance in the hands of an average player, I'm pretty sure that the community's not that biased that they would sort of bury their heads in the sand and say no, the deck's just not good, even though it's consistently providing almost double the expected win rate.
And we can look at a couple of the, for Inala, for example, its win rate has been consistently high, but we do know that there are people very skilled with it who are playing it, and so that's why that kind of helps explain why it's so high. With Tishar, for example, what's interesting to me is that when Heliod was a deck, when Flash Hulk was around, it actually performed a little bit better than we might expect. Now, granted, there were some smaller sample sizes with it, but it was actually in the realm of at or above expectations for quite a while. And then it dropped off the face of the planet. Now, does that necessarily mean that any mono white deck could do the same thing? Not necessarily, but there could be some overlap where, all right, mono white was doing okay, and mono white is doing well now. Maybe there's more to it than first meets the eye, but at the same time, is it to that degree? And I don't have the answer to that question, but I think it's a very relevant question to ask.
That you saying that sort of reminded me, I went back and looked at the last update before the Flash ban, and Sushi Hulk's win rate, which was a deck that more or less everyone agreed was the best deck in the format, by an appreciable margin, had a 40% win rate.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if I am unfairly biased against Tishar, which I allow for that possibility, I don't think anyone would say that Tishar is as good as Sushi Hulk was.
Yeah. And I think
and even Inala or any other deck that seems to be overperforming Golos,
right.
None of these decks are as good as Sushi Hulk was.
And I think the pilot skill really comes into that too. And I think that impacts some of the more popular decks, and certainly with Sushi Hulk probably did as well, where you would have pilots who they picked up Sushi Hulk because it was the best deck in the format, and maybe they bumbled their way into some losses. I know that the first couple times playing the deck for me, there were some pretty bad sequencing errors I made. Sometimes I overcame them, sometimes I lost because of them. And I think that's true for a lot of some of those most popular decks, where they're played because people know, they are cEDH decks, they are accepted upon and agreed upon, and, the average person playing cEDH can play them at, say, a 50% level, but to play, like, Gitrog at, like, that 90% level, you have to be really, really, really good and know the deck inside and out. And most people who are just picking up the deck for the first time because it's popular and they wanted to play it and they wanted to tip their feet into cEDH, they're not going to be at that level yet. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think the numbers reflect that some, especially comparing some of the most popular decks to some of these more fringe decks.
Man, it almost makes me wish that we could build in a game I play. There's these people made these graphs, and it's essentially your overall win rate and how that tracks against your win rate with specific characters. So like some of them have really high skill caps where like the average player doesn't do very well, but then the best overall players do insanely well. And then some have like, players who aren't very good still do pretty well with this. But, at the top end, like it doesn't improve, commensurately. Like the benefits of it drop off.
Ceilings,
like it'd be really
and
interesting to
floors.
see that for cEDH decks. Like, some people will say like, oh, the basics are easy to learn, but like the last 10% is really hard to learn. But like, how hard is is it to get to the 70% mark? That's
like having a general sense of like where a ceiling and a floor is for your average player on any given deck would be amazing. And there's also like, because this is a multiplayer game, there's a lot of pieces in there that aren't even accounted for, right? Like if we're talking about if you're the player going last, it's maybe more important if you are savvy in table politics, right? But not everybody's good at that. Not everybody uses that. And so there's more than just the cards in the deck and on the table. There's, what are you doing for politics? How good's your what tells are you giving away? How's your sequencing? There's a lot that is really interesting that goes into this and is really hard to capture.
One thing I think that would be, a potential thing that a bias or something that could pollute the data a bit is how common decks are built as budget, right? So or like how much variance there are in lists.
Yeah.
So I think Gitrog being a very popular list, and going through all the deck list. The deck list channel on the Gitrog server and seeing everyone with their different take on Gitrog, if they're new and if they're not playing like the standard deck list database list, it can be quite a lot, but obviously this is still going to get marked down as a Gitrog list.
Yeah, and that
and I could see that affecting different decks differently depending on whether or not there's much flexibility there.
And that definitely is a bias on my part too, because like I mentioned with the Zur, like probably all the Zur decks in here could realistically be put together, whereas Eureka, maybe I should have 2 or 3 different Eureka builds instead of lumping them all together, because there's differences in how they're built. But that also gets to kind of a fundamental philosophical question that has come up in this community recently and not so recently within the past years or whatever we want to look at it, but question of like, at what point is a deck a new deck, right? At what point is this innovation actually something that moves it beyond what it once was into something that is an entirely new device? But I definitely think the budget thing is an issue too, and even like suggestions on what to play. I mean, how many players get told when they show up like on the subreddit, oh yeah, build Yisan? Don't build Yisan as a new
Not
player.
anymore.
Don't do it.
I think we finally cured that.
Because it's
New player, you should build Yisan. I think we finally dealt with that.
Don't get me wrong, like, I'm guilty as charged too, because when people would ask for, like, what's a budget deck I can build? I'm like, alright, you can build Yisan budget-wise, but, like, having played a budget Yisan list for a while, you have to really know what you're playing against to do well with the deck.
It's so perverse.
Yeah.
You either have to really know what you're doing or really hate yourself.
It's one of those decks that, like, requires, because there are so many decision trees to make, like, every turn that the deck is built around, it's a lot more complex than people, I think, give it credit for, because it's a mono green deck. I mean, even, like, compared to, say, Sylvala Brostorm. Not to hate on Brostorm, like, it's again, a completely viable and legitimate cEDH deck, and arguably better than Yisan, but I think that the average cEDH player can play Brostorm much more intuitively than they can play Yisan.
Yeah, well, Sylvala requires knowledge of your deck, whereas Yisan requires knowledge of everyone's deck.
Right.
Yeah, Yisan's in a weird spot because you have incredible access to a very limited tool set.
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it. You've got
so you have
every
to know
tool.
It's like exactly what you can do and what you can't.
You've got every tool in the bag, but it's not Batman's utility belt. It's like Robin's underwear drawer.
Awesome. And so our final topic here is on potential uses for the data. So I know you like to give a disclaimer whenever you post this.
Yes, I do.
So, I mean, maybe this is a good time to reiterate that.
Absolutely. These numbers are not intended nor designed nor indicative of any sort of truth about anything. There are issues with these biases we've mentioned. There's issues with sample size. I mean, realistically, I think I've captured maybe 1% of all cEDH games played since this has been going. I think there's a lot more cEDH out there than any of us have seen. And because of that, I think that this project is a way of not defining what the meta is, but questioning what the meta is. And I think other things kind of serve the same role. I think the deck database does sort of the same thing, where it's a shot of what might you expect at a cEDH table. And this is kind of similar, just looking at it through a different lens. What might you expect at a cEDH table? What might happen in that game? When might it end? But nothing here is a stone cold truth. That being said, I do think there's some things that can be used here. I do think that turn information, knowing that if you're playing cEDH, like honest to goodness cEDH, and what that is maybe is up for debate, but you need to be able to do something by turn 2 and turn 3. If you're going to sit there and play lands for the first 3 turns, you're probably not going to be involved in the game, which means A, you're probably not going to have a good time, and B, the other 3 people you're playing with aren't going to have a good time. And that's kind of what's important, right? Everybody should be on the same page there. The other thing that I think is useful is in just kind of addressing, if you know your deck well and what you're trying to do, just thinking about what other decks, how they might be sequencing their plays based on that. Obviously, this isn't deck lists, but knowing that, Najeela is a deck that can be equally a threat at all 3 points of the game, early, late, and mid, probably you're going to allocate your resources differently against that than, say, a deck like Ukima Kazura Food Chain, which is going hard and fast, and you're probably fairly clear if you stop it once or twice.
Cool. Morgan, do you have anything else you want to ask James?
So you're saying I should scrap this big rant I was writing to the RC about how this is proof that they're managing the format all wrong? Is that?
Oh, lordy. The number of people I have apologized to for other people quoting this as though it's scripture is higher than I would like it to be.
Yeah, I love that. It's like look, this says that I'm right, and then you go to the thing and it's like, so these conclusions are preliminary, and there's these biases and those biases that really should be accounted for, but tentatively we think maybe this, and then someone's waving it in your face like,
Yeah.
I'm right.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I think would be interesting to do would be to look at like pod occurrence win rates. I know you have the matchup charts of like losing to deck, like how often does Consultation Cast lose to Elsha?
Yeah.
But like there's the whole there was, I remember for a long time there was the meme about Blood Pod. It's like Blood Pod is a deck that you play to make either the Yisan or the Najila player win.
Yeah. I mean, that.
So like it would be interesting to look through the like, rather than just, oh, this deck loses to that deck, like this deck loses or wins when another deck is in the pod would be an interesting thing to look at.
It really would be.
Definitely.
I definitely have started down that path once or twice, and I'm not gonna lie, after about 5 minutes of doing it, I'm like, this is a lot more work than I think it's gonna be. I need to maybe back off for now and try this some other time. Gotta run a script that scrapes it or something, which again, no computer skills, that becomes hard to do.
Fair. Well, I think that's it for this episode. So just, big thanks for coming onto the podcast.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
has been very informative, and you're a delightful guest.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on. I appreciate the support for the project. Spleen, especially, Morgan, you've helped out with quite a few things at different points, just helping to kind of hone where I'm pointing things at, and that's been immensely helpful in making this actually worth more than a hill of beans.
Well,
so is there anything you want to plug? Any, where can we find you or message you and to complain about, how my deck isn't, tier 1?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, on Reddit, I'm one of the mods of the subreddit, so hit me up at Squirrel Mob there, or on Twitter, I'm at Hoff Occultist, because I'm bad at managing my online presence. But I'm available there. I'm also on Discord, and you can probably find me on Facebook if you look not too hard.
Cool.
All right. I feel like before you go, in lieu of a gut check, you should fire off your hottest take about the results of the Metagame Project.
My hottest take?
Yeah.
All right. My hottest take out of the results of this project. My hottest take out of this project is that most people who want to claim that cEDH is definitively something haven't found what it is yet. I don't think that there's a great definition for what cEDH actually is if you're naming decks or like anything outside of the mindset of I'm building this way for this particular type of game. If you're saying anything other than that, I think you're wrong. That's my hot take.
So you don't know what the right answer is.
3 peppers.
You don't know what the right answer is, but you know everyone else is wrong?
Yeah, that's basically.
I'm on board.
Okay. So that wraps it up for this episode. If you guys would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at IntoNorthPod, via our email intonorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. Also in the description for this episode will be the link to the Metagame Project and the submission form and the most recent report. Thank you to James for coming on the show, and an extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a Patreon, we are at patreon.com/IntoNorthPodcast. Another way you can support us is via our TCG Player affiliate link. So anytime you want to purchase something from TCG Player, if you use our affiliate link, which is in the podcast/YouTube description, a portion of your purchase goes towards supporting the podcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo, and to our long-suffering podcast editor Roadkill. Next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then, see ya.
Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.